work he does and his career path up until this point. So, you know, let's listen and then jot down any questions you may have, because we can ask him some questions at the end as well. And I think you'll find it very interesting. Thank you.
All right, so just a little bit of background. I was an assistant U.S. attorney in large U.S. Attorney's office for 20-some years, and I went from beginner stage, where you do food stamp cases and theft from the mails, right? Theft from the mails. Postal worker takes $5 out of an envelope and runs away with it, and does it a few times. At the end of my career, I was doing major cases against multinational pharmaceutical companies primarily, and learning about how that process works. But it's 2007, and I just finished a case that took 5 years. I went after a company called Medco, which does pharmacy benefits. And what they were doing was they're a mail order pharmacy company, so you'd send in your prescription to get it filled, because your health insurance says you have to send it for mail order. And their response was, it's none of the patient's business. They said, it is the patient's business. They're paying through their health insurance and directly for this prescription. And Medco's position was, well, we talked to the doctors. So we investigated, did they talk to the doctors? Sometimes they did. What did they say to the doctors? Your insurance plan would prefer that the patient take this drug over that drug. Or they would talk to an assistant in the doctor's office. Or sometimes they would just write down they'd talk to somebody when they hadn't. So we'd have problems with that. The other thing they would do, they promised every person who got their prescription would have it turned around in 7 days. And to do this, they had colored pans in their pharmacy. And so what they were doing is, when they got to 7 days and the prescription hadn't gone out, they just went into the system, canceled the prescription, re-entered it the next day, and started the 7-day clock all over again. And we also found there were 400,000 prescriptions they billed us for that we could not find any evidence they filled. So that was 5 years of interviews and putting the case together. And like a lot of big cases, we got to 2 weeks before trial. And up to then they were saying, you know, no settlement, no settlement, no settlement, no resolution. And at that point they decided to pay us $165 million and get rid of some executives. And so that case was over. And I'm looking around because what do I want to do next? This is my third 5-year case. And when you first start doing a 5-year case, it looks exciting. When you're starting on your 4th one, and you realize what it's going to involve, you know, and I thought, I think I want to try something else. So I get a call from, first I got a call from Senator Grassley in Washington saying, would you like to work in my office for 6 months? And my department wouldn't buy that. So then I talked to some friends and said, what other options are there? And about 3 weeks later, I got a call from Governor Elliott Spitzer. And he said, I'd like you to consider being the Medicaid Inspector General for the state of New York. Do you have any New York connections? I said, I worked there during law school twice. My mother lives there, my father lived there, my sister lives there, and my family's been there for many years. And this one is in Philadelphia, by the way. So he said, I'd like you to come to Manhattan and meet with me. And I walk in the room, and he's got the articles I've written about enforcement. And he's got handwritten notes on the side. He talks to me for 30 minutes and then offers me the job. So, you know, I thought it'd be kind of a cool job. I knew nothing about it. I knew New York as a state, I knew the city. I knew nothing about government in New York State, at least nothing in the last 30 years, because I'd worked in Albany in the 70s. And so I landed in this job. Now, when you think about inspectors general, I'm not sure what picture you all have. You're not an inspector, you're not a general, put it that way. Right? You have a responsibility to make sure that a program is run with integrity, somebody else's program. Right? And the reason I had this job, the reason I got this job, is apart from the fact that Governor Spitzer picked me, was that 2 years before, the New York Times had run a series about Medicaid in New York. And it said, New York Medicaid is a system out of control, it's the most expensive in the country. There are people doing all kinds of terrible things, nobody knows what they are, and the state is not paying attention. And the Republicans in the Senate went to the governor and said, you have to do something about this. And the governor said, I don't want to do anything about this. So they passed a bill which he signed, creating the Inspector General job. And so a few months before I started, the office was officially developed. Now here's one of the things that happens in government. Imagine that the governor comes to you and says, I need 100 people out of your organization of 1,000 to start this new agency. Which people will you pick? let's say that the people who've had difficulty adjusting to their prior environment. And so I had 300 people from various parts of the State Department of Health who've been picked by other agencies, picked to be in this new agency. Now some of them were wonderful. They were motivated and driven, and part of the reason that their managers wanted to get rid of them was they were a pain in the neck. They said, we're not doing this right. Others were different, but we had an interesting group. And the first summer I was there, we had a picnic, right? And in the New York State civil service system, you get 4 hours off a year to go to the official picnic. Well, there was the Department of Health picnic, and there was the Medicaid Inspector General picnic. So about half the people couldn't get over the fact they left the Department of Health and said, please can we go to the other picnic? Give you an idea of the excitement when I started. And we did a survey. We did an internal survey to say, how do people feel about the Medicaid Inspector General's office and being here? This is like in the first month I was there. And I've done employee surveys before and heard various things. It was a challenge, right? They were not happy about being there. They weren't sure it was going to work. They wanted to go back to the Department of Health. They didn't like the space we were in, you know. And one of the things you learn about employees is if they're unhappy with their job, they're unhappy with where they go to lunch and where they park. You know, that's Albany. It's kind of, we don't have that problem here in the city. In any event, so the first issue was, how do we get people enthusiastic about this job? How do we have a distinct Medicaid Inspector General, not brand, it's probably too commercial, but what's different, what's special about this organization such that you want to be here? And I was allowed to hire 300 more people, so by the time I finished in 4.5 years, there were probably only 150 of the original 300 left because they retired or moved on or whatever else. What are we going to do different? We have this huge problem. The New York Times says we have it. The federal government says we have it. How are we going to change it? So we walked through some of the things that we focused on. First, I went too fast. The first thing that we did was to focus on data. Right? It sounds dull, but we wanted to identify the providers in New York State who were the problem. And we developed a data group. And then we started bringing investigators and auditors to the data world, looking for early adopters who would be interested in playing with the data we had. And we gave our people access to the data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You know what they did with it? They ran with it. I would get emails on 11 o'clock on Saturday saying, I'm really excited about this stuff, and here's what I found. And I answered them back at 11:03 because I wanted to know that I cared about it, besides my BlackBerry was beeping. My wife was asking, who's that emailing you at 11 o'clock at night on Saturday? So we wanted to get an excitement level. The second thing we did, the federal government runs a training program in South Carolina for Medicaid integrity people. Now, I have people who've been in New York State for 25 years. They had never left the state on state business in 25 years. And some of them have never been out of Albany or Manhattan. They just had never gone anywhere else. They never met anybody who did this work in other states. So over the next 2 years, we sent over 150 people from our office to South Carolina for this training session. Very nice place, but they got to meet their peers and feel like professionals. Professional investigators, professional auditors, professional data people, and they got to teach. And one of the great things about teaching, as you probably know, is that you learn a lot because you have to think about what your subject is and how it works. The next thing we look for were some successes in audits. We're going to take on big players, and we had very specific dollar goals in terms of what we're going to recover, which I wasn't wild about, but that was the law. So we went after the biggest players, and my people were accustomed when they went in and did an audit or they did an investigation, somebody powerful called up and said stop. Who would stop? or at least it would just disappear. So, and so their concern was, what will this new guy from Pennsylvania do when somebody important calls and says stop? And we didn't stop. And ran to the governor at Governor Spitzer's, you know, had to depart, ran to the next governor, and the question was, what will happen next? And Governor Patterson had a limited vision. So when you run into him, you try to introduce yourself again just to make sure he knows who you are, so you're not putting him on the spot. I said, Governor, it's Jim Sheehan, I'm your... And he said, Jim, I know who you are. People complain to me about you all the time. Keep up the good work. But that's the story. I repeat it internally. But when you're going to send investigators and auditors out on the field to do work, to interview, to ask people for things, you got to back them up. And that apparently had not happened before. So if you work in an organization, you're looking to go work someplace, one of the first questions you ask is, have we had a disagreement with clients who are powerful in what happens next? And it only took like 3 or 4 of those confrontations. They also, my people were accustomed, first it was powerful people, and the second group were lawyers. Right? And I can say this because I am one of them, but lawyers' talent is delay. Right? Because in delay, all kinds of things can happen. Witnesses can die, documents can disappear, the prosecutor can move on, the investigators can get tired of the case. So delay always works to the advantage of the defense. So again, I got calls from lawyers, and the legal training is you throw back as good as you get. He said, we will not delay, we will not wait, we're going to go forward, and here's why. And if you decide not to cooperate, we have subpoena power, and we can compel you to appear in Albany, which was a great threat for some people, especially in the winter. And so that you'd get cooperation. But the thing I want to work on the tape in a second, the thing about being an Inspector General that is challenging is you really are nobody's friend, all right? And it's not that they don't like you, it's not they don't respect you, but your job is to identify money that people have gotten, they shouldn't have gotten, to take it back, to identify people who committed crimes and to get them prosecuted, to look for patterns in data and say, why did this happen? We sent out letters to, we learned there are about 300 times a month in New York Medicaid. This is our data analysis. 300 people who were billed, we were billed for services to them after they died. All right. Now, at the time we started this project, I had the assumption that if you were dead, the service could not be billed on your behalf. Right? That's mostly true. But what we did was then we identified, and by the way, 300 a month. And you know what? Month after month, it was the same providers. It wasn't the, like an accident, there are a few accidents, but it wasn't that everybody in the state was billing us per deputy. It was a very small number of providers and a very select area. So we decided to send them a letter. Right? Dear provider, we're looking at the record of patient X. We see that you submitted a claim on this date for services on this date. We'd ask you for 3 things, because it appears from our information that this patient was dead. He was dead at the time the service was rendered. So 1, can you tell us who provided the service? 2, can you tell us who prepared the bill for the service? 3, can you give us the documentation for the service? And 4, can you tell us if he is in fact dead? I rephrase more politely than that, but as it turns out, from our research, there are 10,000 people in this country that the Social Security Administration thinks are dead, were in fact alive. All right. Now, imagine how difficult it is, if you're dead according to the Social Security Administration's records, to convince that agency to reverse the record to say you're alive, right? You're dead. You can't possibly, anyway, there are 10,000 of those people. So we sent out the letters, we say you have 21 days to get back to us for the first 300 for the first month or 2. And so we got, 21 days later, we had 1/3 of the providers that responded to us. Now understand, the new Inspector General is saying, you billed us for somebody who's dead. Can't happen, but not, this is a bad thing. And so I started making calls with my staff because I wanted to see, what are they going to say? What do you say? You billed for a dead person. What are you going to say? And so some of them said, can I get a week extension? That's fine. And then they wouldn't send anything. Yes, another week extension. That's fine. But here, just to summarize, here's what we found. Number one, there were services for which you could bill after the patient was dead. So you know those things that say, I've fallen and I can't get up on television? Well, apparently, if you're alive on the first day of the month, you can bill for the whole month. It's not broken down. So so there are a few of those. But the other things we found was that when patients would die who were like cancer patients who were getting pain meds, the family would show up at the pharmacy after the patient's death and get the prescription refilled. So they had the prescription from before the patient died, and they get a refill after the patient died. And the pharmacist's story was, well, the same person came in with the same script, and it was the relative. Here's where we are. The next thing that we heard, so the pharmacist said, how do you expect me to know who the person is? Well, that's an interesting question. The next thing we found was very senior people in these organizations got these letters, and they didn't know what to do with them. Right? What do you do with a letter from the state saying that you billed for a dead person? So what do they, I don't know if you've ever done this, probably. The men in the room will sympathize more than the women, probably. But you sort of put it away and hope it sort of takes care of itself, right? before you have to deal with it. I've certainly done that in my life. And so they would put it in their desk, and they wouldn't tell anybody, because it's a bad thing to bill for a dead person. So I don't want to own it. One particular institution did this was Bellevue Hospital. So we called 3 times. We got the give you a 2-week extension. Finally, we put out a press release and said, here's, we sent these letters and we got no response for dead people. New York Post ran a story about it. And they had a picture standing next to the Bellevue sign saying, billing for dead people. And I got an angry call from the president of Bellevue saying, why didn't you tell me about this? And I said, on this date I sent your people a letter. On this date I called up, I was told X. On this day I called up, I was told Y. On this day I was called up and told Z. Right? But nothing ever happened. And what was interesting about this experience was people did not have systems in place to figure out how to deal with problems that were identified. Now, these are problems the state identified. Imagine what happens inside the organization when it's identified internally. It's not the state inspector general saying, it is just an ordinary employee. The denial and willingness to ignore it is huge. I'm going to walk back to my tape because I love this. But here's the key. When you think about the cases, so we've talked about some of the problems of being inspector general, but I want to talk about how the cases are put together and what kind of issues you face in the white-collar world putting a case together. And this tape, now some of you have already seen this, thank you. As I say, you're not allowed to tell anybody what the secret answer is. You want to have gone before this? This is a case, a U.S. attorney case from a number of years ago. And the key to this case is Dr. Fittis, who was identified as the bad guy in this tape, did research. He had a large medical practice, and he also did research for pharmaceutical companies, and they would pay him for the research. All right. And when you're a patient in this research, what happens is you sign an agreement saying, yes, you can do research on me. You don't pay anything for the service, right? And they give you free laboratory tests and other things. So you're not a real patient in terms of paying for the service. You're just getting the service. So this starts off with our whistleblower on the tape telling us about what happened.
If you think that the testing of new drugs is confined to lab studies on mice and guinea pigs, you only know half the story. The only way to really know if a drug is safe and effective is to test it on humans. What you may not know is that the rules protecting the real guinea pigs are in many ways stricter than the rules protecting these human volunteers. Those were the conclusions of a number of hard-hitting government reports which found serious problems in how people are recruited into these studies and who carries out the study. Increasingly, the ones doing these drug studies are no longer PhD researchers at large universities. They're family doctors looking for extra cash. Doctors like Robert Fittis, who had a small practice in Southern California. Susan Lester was one of his study coordinators. How many trials did he have going when you were there?
I would say 30 to 40 trials.
And how much was he getting paid by the drug companies for each one of these trials?
I would say an average study would be anywhere from 50,000 to maybe 250,000, depending on the study itself.
A lot of money.
A lot of money. Very lucrative business.
So lucrative, Dr. Fittis eventually gave up treating patients altogether because drug companies were paying him more money to experiment on patients than HMOs were paying him to heal them. Tom Parham was one of those patients. His family doctor, who was one of Fittis's partners, told him that there might be some problems with his prostate and suggested he go see Dr. Fittis to enroll in the study he had going on experimental prostate medicine. So when he told you this, you trusted him?
Oh, yes, I trusted him. He was my doctor, and I figured that it would maybe be beneficial to me later on in life. I mean, what are you going to do?
What the doctor neglected to tell him was that Parham's history of heart problems put him at great risk if he took the medication.
Well, in his records, I noticed the patient had bradycardia,
Which means?
low heart rate. So I told the doctor that the patient did not qualify, but he said, it's okay, we can put him on.
A few days later, Parham felt sluggish and went back to the doctor's office.
And I called up the nurse, and I told her, how I felt, and she immediately took me off of it. And just a few days later, my pulse dropped down to the 20s.
You went to the hospital?
I went to the hospital, right?
What did they tell you?
They told me that I needed a pacemaker immediately.
He ends up in the hospital, and now we have what we call a serious adverse event. It has to be reported.
Now, Dr. Fittis was at risk of being discovered by the government.
Hospital records show that this patient had a history of bradycardia. But he said, don't worry, I will take care of it.
Dr. Fittis took care of it by removing any reference to Tom Parham's long history of bradycardia from his medical records. Parham had no idea this was going on behind the scenes, and he certainly didn't know that Dr. Fittis and his partners were getting money for turning him into a guinea pig.
I didn't realize at that time, by waltzing me down the hall to this research center, he got $1,610 for bringing in a patient.
So he was getting paid for
He was
recruiting.
getting paid big time, right.
But finding patients like Tom Parham and keeping them grew increasingly difficult.
Okay, so here we go. Imagine you are the investigator, and this nurse has just walked into your office and told you this story. Okay, how do you feel about this story so far? Is it the kind of case we should investigate and prosecute? And how do we feel about Susan Lester, who's the nurse? Credible? Well, that's not the correct answer for this part of the session, but why not?
Sorry, what was the question again?
What do you trust Susan Lester? Do you believe
No,
what she said?
I actually don't. I mean, she knew information, and I felt like she should have turned it into doctor as well.
Well, she did. That's why she's here. I'm sorry. That's a fair point. You can't tell in the sequence here, but
Right.
she was the whistleblower. She turned in the doctor after she had stopped working for him. And so then what about Tom Parham? Is he a good victim? Is a bad phrase, but is he a good victim for purposes of making a case?
Yes.
Right. They had no idea what was going on. They walked him down the hallway. $1,610. Now we have to find, in the law, he's not a victim. You know why? Fraud cases are based upon taking money under false pretenses. All right? Tom Parham did not pay for these services. None of his money was taken. His life was threatened, right, by this decision, which might be a state crime, but he was not defrauded because he didn't pay anything. So who paid money and was deprived of the benefit of what they paid for? All right? Yes, actually it's the pharmaceutical companies, right? Because they're the ones who pay for the research. So they've been cheated. Okay, so let's think about this for a second. assuming you're a prosecutor, how excited are you about prosecuting a case where the chief victim is a pharmaceutical company? Right? And on top of that, as we'll see, he's telling this is going on, and they're accepting it. So if we look at her so far, right, she's told a very strong story. She has an altered document. She has, and if this is a swearing contest between the nurse and the doctor, she came forward, right? She did the right thing. So let's see. So when the case walks in, it has some sex appeal, right, so far. When you're an investigator, however, part of what you want to do is to figure out what's the defense going to say. How will they attack the credibility of Susan Lester, the nurse? So let's see what happens.
Especially as more and more studies rolled in. So, Susan Lester says, they started to lower their standards on who qualified for a clinical trial.
Did you have people in high blood pressure studies that didn't have high blood pressure?
Yes,
Did you have people in arthritis studies that didn't have arthritis?
yes. Yes, we did.
In one arthritis study, Dr. Fittis was required to have a radiologist read the x-rays of potential research subjects in order to verify that they had a specific knee problem that was being studied. But Dr. Fittis couldn't find enough patients who qualified. So he asked the company that was sponsoring the drug trials if he could read the x-rays. They said yes.
So Dr. Pitty started reading the x-rays?
Correct.
And what happened?
Then all of a sudden, miraculously, all of the patients qualified for the study.
So he falsified the data.
Oh, yes. And it got worse and worse.
As the money rolled in, Dr. Fittis got even more creative. When he couldn't find patients with ear infections for an antibiotic study, he just ordered up bacteria from an outside lab and faked the specimens. And when he needed certain blood and urine samples, he turned to his own staff.
We started taking each other's blood. We had a colleague there who always showed protein in the urine. We'd have her actually urinate into a container for 24 hours, and she would get $25 per container. Yeah, so she filled up quite a few.
So you just warehoused all of these urine samples and blood samples, and if you needed one, you just went in and got it
Correct?
out of the fridge?
Correct.
Based on a hodgepodge of real and fake data, Dr. Fittis wrote papers that appeared in several reputable journals. Dr. Marcia Angel, former editor of the New...
Okay, so now we have Susan Lester is not just reporting on things that Dr. Fittis did. Right? Now you'll notice the change, they changed the pronouns. Now it's we did this, and you notice that what's his name says you. So what's happening is that this is not all Dr. Fittis is doing. Right? Question.
At what point do you start questioning her reasoning?
You're jumping ahead of me.
Oh.
That's a great question. As an investigator, you want to know from the get-go. You want to know two things. Number one, why is she here? But she's not going to tell you why she's here, right? Because or she'll say, I'm here because I'm upset as a nurse, clinical, all that stuff. So part of what you're doing is trying to figure out what the accurate answer is to that question. The second thing that you want to know is what stuff is the defense going to raise that I need to plan for, right? Because if she's a terrible witness, I'm not going to give her immunity, I'm not going to do other things, and I'm going to look for other people to corroborate every detail of this. She's a very credible witness, and Dr. Fittis can't testify for whatever reason. I can go a different direction, but I've got to think about why is she here, and I've got to think about what are they going to say. So when we do whistleblower cases, right, we get a lot of whistleblowers who come in, and they have a story to tell, and often it's very compelling. And we tell them two things at that point. One is, do you have any documents you took from your employer? If the answer is yes, please give them to us. And the second thing we say is, from here on in, do not take any documents from your employer, right? Because documents they've already taken, not a problem. Documents that they haven't, that they take, which arguably are instruction, Fourth Amendment violation, that will likely get thrown out of the case. So we don't want a Fourth Amendment violation. We do want to benefit one of the have when they walk in. But the other thing we say is, the second instruction is, what are they going to say about you? And so the first answer is nothing. So then we walk through our list of questions. We have Petraeus question. Right. Have you had an affair? Number 2, have you taken money from any other organization? When you left, were you fired or did you quit? Were you ever disciplined? And you can and some fairly personal questions, but we need. I mean, it's sensitive and it's somewhat unpleasant, but you need to know the answer to those questions on the front end. You don't want to find them out when you're sitting in the courtroom and the defense lawyer is asking the questions, and you watch your case sort of disappearing down the chute. So, so now we have Susan Lester. By the way, Susan Lester is a nurse, registered nurse in the state of California. Should she be allowed to keep her license after she's done this? What do you think? No? How many say no? Okay. How many would let her keep her license despite participating in this? Okay, so it's a 50-50. So one of the, well, why should we let her keep her license?
I guess eventually her conscience and her oath that she took brought her forward.
See, you could be a prosecutor because you've got the right attitude. But here's the thing, right? If you see enough of no perfect human comes into the investigator or prosecutor arena, right? They all have flaws. They go through various process analysis. But here's that's my human experienced prosecutor view. But here's the other problem. What am I going to do with the defense question, which is, Ms. Lester, do you still have your nursing license in California? Yes. Do you know if there was a referral of your conduct to the California Nursing Board? Now, there are 3 bad answers to this question. The first one is yes, because then we want to see what happened to it. Is it being handled? The second one is no, because we'll see the follow-up question in a second. And the third is I don't know, because no one's going to believe that. So if the answer is no, did the prosecutor make any promise to you about whether your case would be referred or not? And it doesn't matter what she says at that point, because it's been planted in the jury's mind. And it's not an improper question. Okay, so now we have Susan Lester. We have to decide, does she get immunity? Because when she started saying we, she's involved in the fraud scheme, right? And believe me, Dr. Fittis was not going down to the mailroom and picking up these samples and calling these places on the phone. He was having other people do it. He wasn't standing there getting out $25 to this woman with the urine in the cup. He wasn't sitting there taking blood samples, right? That was being done by the state. So now we have 7 or 8 other people. What do we do with them? Do we prosecute all of them because they're participating in the scheme? And if we do, who's going to testify for the government? So we have to make a decision about whether to give each of those people immunity. Or whether, and if we don't give them immunity, do they get any assurance they're not going to be prosecuted? Right? So that's typically what they get, is an assurance they won't be prosecuted. But now I have 8 people lined up against Dr. Fittis, who's not in the room when most of the stuff is taking place, saying that we all did this together, but it was at he wanted us to do it. All right? That's going to, and there'll be various versions of he wanted us to do it, but he's not going to tell each of these staff members. He's going to have most of his conversations with Susan Lester. So she becomes critical to making this work. That hospital record you saw altered, it's pretty clearly altered because there are 2 versions of it. Who did the alteration? How do we tell? It's going to be, there are ways to do it. If it was word processed or there's somebody taking dictation or whatever, and which documents first, that's going to be tough. There's a shot there. So now here's the next problem. Apart from Susan Lester and a nursing license and all the people with immunity, when the jury goes back to the jury room, what are they going to think about what her motive was? Why did she come forward? What do you think?
To get, off the hook, or probably get a lesser charge or
So
a lesser
she's
sentence.
doing it as part of a deal to avoid,
Like a plea bargain.
or at least she knows there's a bad thing going on. She doesn't want to be caught in the middle of it, so she's going to come forward first. So that's
She
protect
wants to,
herself.
what is it called? mitigate.
Right, right. She's going to
Very
show
well.
she came forward. This is your, so what's your theory?
But I think also from early on, she had some type of inclination that what she was doing was wrong when she said she brought forth that, he said we should not be doing that. So I think early on she was, her
So-
morals or conscience.
So you're going to say, protect yourself, you're going to say some morals or conscience.
Yeah.
You're
I was here, so I can't
you
answer.
can't answer it. That's right.
I mean, I guess it would be fair to say that she falls under the a cooperating witness.
You've had too much legal education at this point. You've got to think like a human. You were here this morning, so that's not fair. Okay, you're in the jury. Okay, so let's see about motivations. Conscience, self-protection. What else?
She's got a grudge against the doctor.
Okay, she's got a grudge against the doctor. Why?
She didn't pay her enough.
Okay.
There's a bunch of things.
Okay, revenge. What other possibilities?
Money, maybe she wanted a cut of it.
Okay. This is the New York progression. All right. Money is the root of all evil.
Bitter X or something.
Pardon me?
Bitter X.
Bitter X. Okay. But there's an S letter missing from that,
Yeah.
right? But the three issues that the jury is always going to think of is self-protection. Actually, 4: self-protection, revenge, money, and sex. All right. And the funny thing is, in each situation like this, in each case like this, the jurors, from what I hear talking about afterwards, sex is not the first issue that comes up in the conversation. But guess what? It's the first issue that comes up in people's minds, and the defense lawyer doesn't have to say a word about it, because they're all thinking about, why would she do this? They're not all as generous as you are about conscience and doing the right thing. And so they leap to conclusions. Well, that's not fair. Juries are supposed to make decisions based upon reason and their experience. And so what is our experience of human conflict? Doing the right thing, revenge, self-protection, money, and sex. And that's what's going to, so if I'm the prosecutor, even if the case goes in perfectly, and I'm the investigator, and I've gotten every witness and locked them down their statements and it all fits, they go back in that jury room and they're thinking about reasonable doubt. And they're thinking, am I sure that she isn't doing this because she had an affair with him, and they're going to use their experience. There's a certain level of skepticism in the world about this issue, but that's what we're going to face. So Dr. Fittis went to jail. Went to jail for a year. And to me that's a low number, and the sentencing guidelines are a very low number, but the risk for the prosecution going to trial is much worse. Because you'd have this entire trial going out, at the end of which the jury would come back with a not guilty verdict. All right, so this is what you face in the investigative world on a regular basis. Not that one person did one bad thing and the rest of the world is blameless. Typically, in a fraud case, especially a healthcare fraud case, there's a lot of things to go around. Right? The rules were insufficiently clear. I talked to a lawyer once about this, and he made it sound like it was okay. I didn't know what the rules were. There are a whole series of issues you have to wrestle with. And so there's a lot of room, both in arguing about facts and arguing about rules, to have this not be a problem. I hate to do this to you guys, but you've seen it already. I want to talk about 2 other cases. Can we switch to the slideshow? I'm going to go quickly to 2 cases. Which summarize to me sort of where the world is going in these kinds of cases. And one of the rules you have as Inspector General is you're not allowed to talk about the evidence in cases that you worked on that hasn't become public. So what I've done with each of these 2 cases, I sort of searched through other things other people were doing to give you an idea of how the cases are put together. So everything I have here is from the public record. Dr. Howard Goldstein was a Missouri psychiatrist, and we're going to see the importance of electronic records, data analytics, compliance programs, background checks, and what I call the power of 18 U.S.C. 1001, obstruction. All right. Obstruction is lying to a federal agent. So if the federal agent comes to your house and says, did you murder this person? Right. You're entitled under the 5th Amendment to say, I don't have to talk to you. No problem, no violation. If you say no, which is most people's first inclination when a federal agent asks them this question, lying about it, the saying of the no is a federal felony. And most white-collar fraud cases are not won on the fraud itself, right? The Dr. Fizz situation. Most federal cases are won based upon the obstruction, the false statement to the investigator, the destruction of documents when a subpoena is issued. That's how the cases are won. And if you're going to do investigations as Inspector General or as an investigator, what you're hoping for, this is terrible to say, when you serve the subpoena, you're hoping that they're loading the documents into the van to take into the dumpster. Because regardless of what they were doing before that, the destruction of those records is a federal crime, which the juries don't understand, right? The guilty man fleeth where no man pursueth. It's what the Bible says, and that's, you know, but the key here is you destroy the documents, the must be hiding something. Or they alter records. I've seen doctors who get subpoenas and they go back and they alter the records to show they actually did the service in some detail. They've been much better off with a record that's blank and with a record that's altered that we can show after the fact by inks or and today by metadata. But the human tendency to cover up is incredibly powerful. Dr. Goldstein, he was a workhorse. He saw dozens of patients at a time, but does not write well. That's what his defense lawyer says. So the lawyer says Goldstein's employer questioned his billings because there was nothing to support it, right? So to deal with that, Dr. Goldstein started using computerized records where you could just cut and paste. I'm sure no one here has ever cut and pasted anything, so it's hard to imagine that, but I've certainly done it in some of my slides. The issue here is when you do computerized records, they're much easier to search. Because I can go look for a specific block or phrase. If it's paper records, I have to go through hundreds of records by hand and look at them. When it's computerized records, I just look for the phrase in whatever the phrase is going to be. Reports no suicidal ideation, for example, common phrase in psychiatric records. But if you run it and then you look for the words around it and it keeps appearing over and over, now we have a clear situation of cut and paste, and you're going to see language that is inappropriate for the patients. I've seen this, for example, where we had a case where they were doing what are called echocardiograms. Basically, it's an ultrasound of the heart, and the radiologist report would say ultrasound of the heart grossly normal. Well, that was great, except for the patients who had pig valves or artificial valves or had previous infarcts or other things that we could show from other records. And when you computerize it this way, it's much easier to do, much easier to catch. So his employer, they had a compliance program, right? And they looked at 2007, and his records were scant and illegible. They thought about firing him, but they sent him to coding education class, which is a common practice in compliance. Saturday morning at 7 o'clock, you're going to report bright and early to be educated in coding. 2009, they again looked at him in their compliance program, and they called up the Department of Justice. So what did Dr. Goldstein do when he was when the issue was reported to the compliance officer and he was talked to about it? The answer is he moved to Baltimore from St. Louis. Right? On the theory, I guess, that the law wouldn't follow him there. For cooperating with the government, St. Charles Medical Group had to pay $865,000 in 2011. But what happened to Dr. Goldstein? 5-month prison term, $30,000 fine, forfeiture of $100,000, $1.7 million in civil settlement. This is what he was doing, upcoding. 5 minutes of work, 20 minutes of the session. That's a hard case to win for against a psychiatrist, right? You did 5 minutes, but you billed for 20 minutes. What's a psychiatric minute? Is it? Because we all know they only do 50 minutes for an hour, right? That's in the billing practice of the American Psychiatric Association. You'd never get to send them to jail for 5 minutes and 20. How would you prove how much time you spent with each patient when you saw 12 in 3 hours? Very hard to do. The reason he lost, the reason he's going to jail, is because he lied about it. They showed him the records and he lied about it. So you'll ask, where is Dr. Goldstein now? Dr. Goldstein moved to Maryland. He served his 5 months, 2 months in prison and 3 months in home confinement. He has his medical license in Missouri and Maryland, and he's practicing medicine in the Baltimore area. But he can't practice medicine. He can't build a Medicare program or the Medicaid program because he's kicked out for 5 years. So he has hormone replacement therapy for patients who pay in cash. Just see what I've got. Go to the next case, which is the maximum healthcare case. And again, one of the big areas that we focused on in the Medicaid Inspector General's office was home health. And the reason was, for many years, it was impossible to tell whether the home health aide was actually in the home at the time that they built it. And so how do you investigate that? Well, in the old days, with paper records, it was impossible. Today, what we have is electronic tracking. So if I walk in a patient's home, I call from their phone to a phone service, and when I leave, I call into the phone service as well. In the first year this was implemented in the city of New York, the billings for home health services went down by 8%. So maybe that's just rough around the edges. And then we started to find that people were in 2 places at once, right? Because it was just reporting the use of the phone, it wasn't reporting the voice on the other end. So people were having the client call, they'd be in one apartment here and one apartment here, they'd call in simultaneously. So we now have what's called a conflict report. It's showing that the worker was in 2 places at once. We'll see now, again, it's not about the billing as much as it is about the obstruction. And I have discouraging testimony there. Again, a question you want to ask in doing an interview. Has your employer talked to you? Has your boss talked to you about this investigation? All right. Yes. If the answer is yes, that's fine. What did he or she say? Here's obstruction. You're not allowed to talk to any federal agent. If you talk to a federal agent, you'll be fired. That is a federal crime. That's obstruction. All right. Don't tell them about X. All right. That's obstruction. Don't show them the records from Y. That's obstruction. Make sure you clean your hard drive from the computer before anybody comes through. That's obstruction. So, and again, you don't win. You win the cases on the obstruction much more easily than you do on the underlying crime. So, the key is for an investigator and inspector general is to get the evidence of obstruction. And the natural tendency of a lot of people, especially people who are bosses of their own organizations, is when they hear these investigations to tell their employees to shut up and not talk to anybody. Right? A newspaper reporter calls you, don't tell them anything. That's perfectly legal. Not a problem with that. If my wife calls, tell her I'm in a meeting, right? It's wrong, but it's not a crime. Assuming your wife's not a federal agent. But when you say, do not talk to federal investigators, that's a crime. So how did the government find out about this case? And the answer is what we're seeing more and more, which is whistleblowers. All right? And whistleblowers are not just ordinary humans like Susan Lester who walk in the door. Today they come in with a lawyer. They come with a lawyer because they can get 15 to 25% of whatever the government recovers in the case. All right, so this one whistleblower about 3 years ago got $110 million. I should say he and his lawyer got $110 million. So people have much more of an incentive not only to come to these lawyers for these cases, but also to tell them, for the lawyers to figure out whether there's a strong case there. So as Inspector General, and when I was an Assistant U.S. Attorney, people used to just walk in with a sheet of paper and say, these guys did bad things, do something about it. Today they walk in with a book, right, of records, of interviews, of computer information, of stuff they pulled off the internet to say, this is the case, this is where they are. Question there?
Earlier you said that when they come in, you can't tell them, go get any more information.
Right.
But when they consult with the lawyer before coming to you guys, is the lawyer allowed to say, well, you need to make sure the evidence is stacked up against them before you bring it to the...
Now, as you can imagine...
15 to 25%.
As you can imagine, the defense bar is not happy with this rule, and in some cases they start to file suit against the whistleblower saying you stole your employer's information. But that's a hard case to win if the documents No, if or the documents show that the employer was stealing, because then it's, historic job. So so here's our patient whistleblower, and very compelling story. He's on oxygen, he wasn't getting nursing care because there was a spending limit. And he checked his own medical records against what they said he was provided, and he found they overbilled Medicaid for hundreds of hours for people who were never there. It was very interesting to me among Medicaid and Medicare patients. You figure most people don't know what services they got. One of my first cases, I was out with the senior investigator said, I want you to go to the houses of the patients and talk to them. Now, this was not usually done in the U.S. attorney system. Witnesses are brought to us. We sit in our office, we have the flag and the picture of the Attorney General and the President and the eagle, and we ask people questions. But she said, I want you to go out to the house, I want you to see these people and get to know them. And I said, she knows more than I do, she's been doing it longer. So I went out. And you'd meet people on Medicare, and they would have shoe boxes, right? Inside the shoe boxes were 3x5 index cards. You can remember what those things were like. With the date of the service, what person they saw, how long they were there, what time they came back, their taxi fare if they had to take a taxi. Tremendous detail. And so when the defense came back, as my investigator assumed they would, and said, these are old people, they're forgetful, we'd have the shoebox, and Mrs. Jones saying this was going on. But Richard West was a shoebox, what we call a shoebox witness. And they are incredibly compelling witnesses. They're a pain in the neck because you have to go through and spreadsheet everything, or Excel spreadsheet everything. But when you have them there, they're killer witnesses. Excuse the expression, but they are incredibly effective witnesses. Okay, so this company eventually agreed to pay $150 million, right? And 9 current and former maximum employees pled guilty. Well, what's going on here? Remember in our last case, we got to Dr. Fittis, one person out of all the people engaged in the scheme. How did they get 9 people to plead guilty? And the answer is, let me just get through these. The answer is, the company has identified and disclosed to law enforcement the misconduct of former maximum employees, including providing information critical in obtaining conviction of some of those pleading guilty. And they increased their compliance program. Now, you'll notice where this is from the DOJ press release. I will call this a negotiated press release, although officially we don't negotiate press releases. All right? So what happened is the company went in and gathered evidence showing the obstruction efforts of 9 senior employees who were all convicted. So if you're in the investigation business or you're trained to do investigations, the good part of this story is, number one, they're investigators on the government side. Number two, they're investigators on the whistleblower counsel side. Number 3, they're investigators inside this company. And number 4, they're investigators from the law firm that represent them. And number 5, they're increasing the resource for compliance programs, so there's more investigators there too. That is more and more the pattern. Right? In order not to be convicted as a corporation, what you do is you give up your senior managers or your middle managers. Okay, so each of these jobs, the people were fired. Chief Executive, Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Operations Officer, Chief Culture Officer, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Financial, and Vice President Human Resources, and the General Counsel. All of them are now gone. And a number of these people were convicted. So what you look at here is, in the old days, it was the government doing the investigation and prosecution. Today, it's the Whistleblowers Council and the internal people at the company doing the investigation and turning over the information for prosecution to the government. We'll talk about the penalties. The key to me about this case, too, is there's no Medicare with federal prosecution. The cooperation against senior executives. In Medicaid home health, traditionally a difficult thing. Patient's whistleblower. I'll skip the rest of them. Okay. The next piece is being Inspector General. So these are how we put cases together. And we work closely with the prosecutor, and we look for that evidence of obstruction in addition to the evidence of the underlying violation. And we look for the cooperation of the company. The other thing that inspectors general do, we don't just want to prosecute people. Actually, what we really want is for people to follow the law. And to do that, we have to explain what the law is. We have to explain what particular things we're concerned about. And so when I first started at the Medicaid Inspector General, I talked to some of our staff and said, we really should have an education program. We should tell people what the rules are, and we should make them relatively clear to the extent that we can. And the response from some of my senior staff were, well, if you tell them what they can't do, then we won't have any audits or prosecutions. And I said, I've been in this business long enough, I think we're pretty safe. Then what will happen is the good guys will follow the rules, and the bad guys will assume we're not serious, which is pretty much what happened. So every year, the Inspector General in the state and the federal government issues a work plan that says, by the way, these are things we really care about. Claims within active or invalid physician identifier numbers. So here, this is a service rendered by somebody who's not a physician or ordered by somebody who's not a physician. You can't get paid for it. Beneficiaries of multiple Medicaid ID numbers. This is for managed care. So why would somebody sign up the same beneficiary 3 times? By the way, they get paid for each one. But who within the managed care organization has an interest in signing people up 3 times? Does anybody here work in sales? No. Okay. So that's a very different culture. Sign up people 3 times, you get 3 commissions, or you get bonuses, or you get to keep your job if you're not doing it. You go through all this work to kick Dr. Goldstein out of the system. Are you billing for his services? What we find in New York is that when we kick people out, they don't just go away, they go work for somebody else. Right? And they bill through. They pretend it's Dr. X when it's actually Dr. Y. Overpayments. We started looking at, you have 2 kinds of insurance, right? You have Medicaid and you have what's called Aetna. And what happens was the doctors were billing, doctors and health companies and prescription drug companies were billing both the private insurance and the government insurance, and then keeping both. Right? You can't do that. Private insurance is always first. So what we found was they were double dipping, and so we said we need to pay attention. I'm going to skip through here. I think the big thing to understand about the future of this business, both at the Medicaid Inspector General's office and elsewhere, is the using electronic data and predictive modeling. And predictive modeling just says, if you see X, you're going to see Y down the road. Right? But so there's a course here called digital forensics, which is some of the same kind of stuff. But this is the future, and not just in government service, but there are a huge number of private companies using the same tools, and the people who are coming of age and graduating out of John Jay now are going to have a huge advantage over people who graduated 20 years ago. Because you grew up using computers, right? And you grew up thinking in terms of data and relationships, which we did not. So a little bit of old-fashioned data mining. Edits where one of the things that bad guys do is they test systems to see who pays for what. And so they'll test it once. If the claim gets paid, they can send more. If the claim doesn't get paid, they send less. They change it. Inpatient, outpatient, the same day. I've talked about that a little bit. Let's see. I've talked about patients dead at the time the service is rendered. By the time we finished this project a year later, we went down from 300 dead patients a month to about 180, which is not a huge success, but it also allowed us to focus on the ones who were frequent flyers, right? The ones who over and over billed us for services on patients who were dead. So ambulance companies and diaper type supplies were the 2 big hitters. I'm going to skip through one. So the one other thing is what we try to do is to teach compliance officers what to look for. Okay, that's so the overpayments that we said look for. Do you check the people who work in your organization against the excluded persons list? So we found someone excluded from being a child molester working in a place that gave services to children with disabilities. Service provided deceased persons, claims billed and paid twice. We would go back and find out that they had billed us for a dead person or billed us for a person who was in the hospital at the time that they were getting home health. So they would bill us, and we would collect the money back to them. And then a month later, they would bill us again. What was that about? And again, the first assumption is bad people doing bad stuff. As it turns out, they have automatic billing programs. So if they see a claim is unpaid, right, they then bill it again until it gets paid. So when I look at both the Medicaid Inspector General's office and my job at HRA now in Resource Administration, these are the skills we really need. Data analysis, algorithm design, and predictive modeling. And the next one is business and profession specific knowledge. What you know about the, and most everybody here has a job outside of school, right? Almost everybody. You know a lot about business work. That somebody who must just been a federal investigator or a state investigator doesn't know. You know? What is the vice president of a bank? Everybody's the vice president of a bank. You may not have much of a salary, you may not have much of an office, but you're a vice president, and your vice president's charge is sitting on the platform and greeting the customers. So that's business you can only know from working in a bank. If you're a nurse, you know what the relationship is between physicians and nurses, right, and what the dynamics are. If you are in the mortgage loan business, you know what clients are likely to say to you in order to get a loan. Because these lies tend to occur in predictable directions. You're going to tell me when I'm done, right? Am I done?
Yes.
Okay, I'm done.
Winding.
Okay. So there we go. So this is the hook is out. This is the OMIG website, model compliance programs, specific audit reports, the work plans I talked to you about, an excluded provider list. Every person's been kicked out of the program. How to confess. People who don't confess, what happens to them. And this also sends out everything that you need to know about, or did when I was there. So we educate providers before the problem happens. And if you'd like to contact me, here's my email address. I really appreciate the chance to talk to John Jay today, John Jay and all of you. And I will tell you, being Medicaid Inspector General is probably the best job I ever had in my life. And you say, well, why'd you give it up? And the answer is, I served 3 governors. The first one hired me, the second one kept me, the third one spent 6 months and then said, we want to go in a different direction. And that is the nature of 2 things. One is of political appointments, right? Governor Cuomo got elected, he gets to decide. And it's also the nature of the compliance function. You don't last more than 3 to 5 years, and then you've got to go somewhere else because you've antagonized enough people by pointing things out they don't want to really hear about that you have to move on. So I'm delighted to be here in New York City, and I will just as Governor Spitzer, who was incredibly supportive, Mayor Bloomberg, and Commissioner Doar, who's the head of HRA, was incredibly supportive. And if you're thinking about any compliance job inside a private company, and you don't get the support of the people you're working for, don't take it and don't keep